Hello, I'm Lady Balefire, and you're back for the second round of our fanfiction discussion with Alex from the Whitecloaks. And we're kind of structuring this like the good, the bad, and the ugly, so part two will be the bad. And in this section, we are going to talk about fanfiction and its influence on like pop culture and literature in general, and how it has kind of changed the way that we see just like literature and published books and kind of like film and television as well. Now, I have to say that definitely I've been probably writing fan fiction like for at least like 10, 15 years, probably longer altogether. But one of the weirdest things I've noticed is that it seems that fan fiction in and of itself has become kind of its own genre. I have noticed there's been so many like what would be fan fiction like type of books. Like my mom just got something from the library that was basically like a modern retelling of Fall of the House of Usher. I've seen so many like basically a feminist take on a XYZ story. Like I just saw like a Great Gatsby being retold from the point of view of the women in that story, and I just think of that story and I think like, with the exception of maybe one person, the women in that story were so awful, I really would never even want to read that. So have you seen stuff like that or like anything like that in your own experience as a reader?
I think we all have seen one very significant example of that, and that is we're going to say, second or third biggest literature franchise of my lifetime, which is Twilight, was
Yes,
fan
Twilight.
fiction. So, I would argue that Twilight and every single one of Twilight's hellaciously evil offspring
Yeah,
are
it was like, what was
perfect.
it, like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey or something like that? I don't remember what
I'm
exactly it
sorry,
was.
yeah. 50 Shades of Grey was
I've
Twilight
found
fanfic.
that, like, I've found so many copies at used bookstores, because I'm a big fan of used bookstores, and I'm just reading through it, and I'm like, oh, good lord, this is, like, the worst kind of stuff I would read on AO3, and I can't believe it's actually, like, published literature, and it's bestseller, and I was just like, what the heck is this? And I don't know, that's probably, like, my personal pet peeve with fan fiction is just seeing it totally penetrate the mainstream. Like, I've read fan fiction for so long, it's really easy for me to recognize the kind of tropes that we see. So, like, I know when we talked about this before that got us to do this video, we were talking about, like, the rise of, like, the Mary Sue and the Gary Stu characters, and I've seen that a lot in literature, especially when you start reading young adult literature, which is basically, I think, the easiest thing for people who write fan fiction to try to transition to in terms of published literature, because that's sort of your audience anyway. And I just hate that. Like, what is your kind of feelings on like the Mary Stu, Gary Stu phenomenon?
I mean, I think it goes without saying that it makes for horrible content.
It does,
Um,
honestly.
with certain exceptions, I think there's some, um, like escapist stuff, but
Yeah, I
it's
think like this,
very
it's like this self
rare.
insert too. Like, we definitely see that in, I know that we've been kind of dealing with that because we're both Wheel of Time fans and we kind of met through the White Cloaks thing. And it's just like a lot of the stuff that the showrunner for that show does is like basically like Gary's do like self inserts kind of stuff. And they've turned all of the female characters from that book series into Mary Sue's. And that's like really annoying. And we've also seen it in such franchises as like the Star Wars sequels, like the Disney stuff, and it's awful because like a Mary Sue is like, and I'll put a definition up here so everyone knows this. It's like a character that's very like, they can do no wrong, they're perfect, everyone likes them, and they don't go through the kind of character struggles that we get with that. And I know that when we talked about this, you were mentioning that um like like a like fan fiction and everything sort of like fosters the idea that it's okay to change like existing characters and stuff like that too, and that was kind of like the Mary Sue thing that happened with inserting this kind of too good character into Star Wars and stuff like that. And I definitely noticed that in like modern stuff is that you're definitely like getting those kind of fan fiction tropes, and it's not just the archetypal characters, but it's also sort of the writing style. Like I know when I've read something, it's just the like maybe it's the level of maturity in the writing and the specific like stylistic kind of with like language and stuff like that, and the I think structure of a lot of the stuff. Like I read a fantasy novel and I was like, I could just tell this person wrote fan fiction because it was like alternate. It was one. The first chapter was alternating POVs between like what was obviously kind of a female Mary Sue character and then your like kind of sort of antagonistic male character. And it was like, if I had to give a tag for this on like AO3, I would say like love to hate or something like that. And it just to me like felt like something I would find on AO3, and it wasn't really like professional writing. But I was wondering if maybe you had any thoughts on that too.
Well, I think we talk about fan fiction sort of penetrating into the the mainstream. I think we've reached the point where Hollywood's current rules for writing women characters have basically fostered a situation where Mary Sues are basically impossible to avoid.
Yeah, like
Uh,
it's sort of become kind of like the de rigueur thing for writing with writing, and I think that's one of me as a writer and somebody that's wanted to move from fan fiction to professional writing. That's been one of my biggest pet peeves, is seeing this kind of like all of a sudden things that are okay for like and popular with fan fiction is all of a sudden become mainstream. And it's like I think the greatest things is like Rings of Power, like with like Galadriel, like we like call her in the fandom because she's so different from the original character. Have you been watching that show or
I have.
or maybe there's another show or something like that where you've seen it, because I know you're kind of like in a different fandom than I'm in.
No, I think um, Rings of Power is the perfect example of um, the what's the right word
Sort
for
of
it?
like fanfic. And I think you mentioned this when we were first talking about it. Is this like you said it was like the idea that it's okay to change existing characters to suit your own personal like tastes or experiences and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think Galadriel in Rings of Power is sort of the perfect example of fan fiction sort of getting in and ruining something, in the sense that um, the showrunners and the writers of these episodes decided that Galadriel was going to be one thing. She was going to be Xena Warrior Princess, and then they went and they basically found a bunch of quotes that they sort of twisted out of meaning, and to create this thing that didn't really exist. And it's the what is the was it Oscar Wilde who gave the quote, an idiot uses facts as a drunkard uses a light post, not for illumination but support.
Yeah,
um,
I definitely see that, because like I think like in my notes of this, I put one of the things was like it's like catering to fans' expectations. Or there was just like this tweet from like Mark Hamill saying that like if you feel like Luke Skywalker is gay, then he's gay. And to me, that was just really obnoxious, because I think Star Wars has always been a pretty like PG kind of a franchise, and anyone's like sexual romantic interests of not really like that hasn't been a thing. Kind of similar with like Wheel of Time, where like sex and that kind of stuff is not really a big issue in that like book series, even though there are definitely gay people in there and all sorts of like diversity in the story. But like when we see it in the show, it's like, yeah, everyone's gay, and there's all of this like added stuff that just because the writers and the showrunners of that show personally felt like that's something that needed to be in the story.
yeah, and I think you can see it in the way that the social media reacts to shows.
Oh god, yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, I saw something on Twitter the other day. It was the people reacting in horror at the thought of Moraine and Tom Maryland getting married because
Yeah, that was pretty funny. I mean, like that definitely happens in the books, and to me, I was kind of surprised just because more like I don't even remember even getting a hint that they had a relationship, but I think people from the show were like, we can't have straight people.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I think Wheel of Time is so great is that on a reread, um, man, Tom Maryland and Moraine were word fucking from the first the first
I
minute
got
of
I read all of the whole series of that, and then I went back and was just like, oh my gosh, the level of foreshadowing in this stuff is wild. And I was
the
just so shocked at like all of the stuff that Robert Jordan put in there that I was just like really just blown away by it. And I think that's a good point with the fan fiction is that like there's definitely something in the fan fiction community where people like there's fan fiction where you can write something that like you feel like the author would have written, or like you try to respect the author's like style, or you really like the work and you try to respect what like is had in it. And I don't feel like in the fan fiction world like that's such a huge thing, because like we see this especially now that like people that's like cut their teeth writing fan fiction are now adults and they're working in the like entertainment industry, and it's sort of like they don't seem to have that kind of respect for the original content creators. Like I know you've seen that. Can you think of any other like good examples that you've seen in like maybe your fandoms or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's essentially every fandom.
Yeah.
I mean, has there been a single adapted fandom that has escaped some kind of
Yeah.
uh, ideological change in order to fit a modern audience?
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking because you're right, like, Bucky and Winter Soldier, it's like there's definitely the move of we need to make, like, Steve Rogers isn't Captain America, we're just gonna give it to somebody else because it's just the suit, right? And I've always felt that was really weird because of the kind of, like, having read the comics. I'm not a huge comic reader. I definitely have, like, I think my favorite thing is X-Men, and I really appreciate the comics, and it's just, like, even with the X-Men thing, it's kind of weird to me because I had to say of like probably all of the ones I've read, like it seems like X-Men was probably kind of like the Wheel of Time where it had like the most diverse people, it had the most like I mean, and they had everything. They had like all sorts of different races of people. There were like canon gay people, and it was like they're still changing it because and to me, I see as a fan fiction writer and reader, again, they're like applying like fan fiction tropes to it, and I think that's where a lot of the fan service stuff comes in. Like, do you see that too, like the fan service coming into these like adaptations and stuff?
Absolutely, and it's one of the things that I think is interesting is the fan fiction audience is an audience that is very online, both as far as
Yeah, they're very
regular,
vocal.
yep, and as far as social media. So when companies do market research and they think, they look at something like Wheel of Time and they think like, well, okay, what does the Wheel of Time fandom want? They go online, they see, everybody hyping up the Moraine Swan relationship, which was,
Ah!
you know, when I say barely in the books, I mean
Which is
not
yeah.
functionally in the mainline novels at all. So the company that doesn't know any better just looks at the social media data and says, "Yep, got to hook these two
Yeah.
up. Not only does it look good for our representation score and other aspects, it's apparently what the fan base wants, and that's
Yeah, and that's a
not
problem with
the
that
case."
is that they look at like the fandom communities and you'd see like the I mean god, if you go on AO3 and you just search the tags, that's like there's definitely a predominance of certain things. And I think that's probably one of the annoying things for me is that you have like these really cliche fan fiction tropes and they're coming into the story. It's like you have the hurt/comfort story, you have the dubcon story, which is dubious consent, which means like oh, it's kind of rapey, maybe it isn't, and then you have like the whole rise of gay shipping, and I've noticed a lot of that stuff is sort of like coming into actual professional like either literature or I mean definitely with like printed the printed medium, I've seen that. I mean, I can't think of how many Marvel characters they decided, okay, this person's gay. I mean, I'm watching it myself where,
Oh,
like, yeah, there's always like some kind of hints, like in House of the Dragon. It's like they have that like hinted like Alicent and Rhaenyra conversation where they're talking about eating cake, and Rhaenyra's happy to stay in the position she's in, and she's sitting in Alicent's lap. And then they also had this weird scene that was basically like Daemon saying like thank you to a servant, and they're trying to use that to say, oh well, he's bisexual because that's what the fandom wants. And that drives me crazy because it's definitely not in the source material, and to me it seems like you're not respecting the author's work when doing that. But I think with House of the Dragon it's weird because of George R. R. Martin's like actual involvement in the project. But I think you've definitely probably seen that in like anything that you've been involved with too, like for sure.
yeah. I mean, you want to talk about shows getting it bad and like Marvel TV getting it bad. Good Lord, Marvel and DC Comics have been getting it raw for a decade
Oh
now.
god, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if DC Comics is going to survive the next 2 years just because nobody's buying their shit, and the solution to people turning away and not buying gay Superman is apparently
Oh,
to
I'll get
make
them rid.
him.
I mean, like, I think She-Hulk is a really great example of this kind of phenomenon. Like, that's definitely. Oh my goodness, it's like they went full on. They went full bore with the like fan fiction kind of fan service stuff. So it's like it's a very like man hating show. It's like big on the feminism, big on the misandry. I mean, I saw a clip of it with this like male character that was, I think he was getting divorced, and they had just have the guy throwing himself out the window, and like they're going with a kind of like Mary Sue there, and then people hate it. They don't want to watch it, and then there's all of the cast and fans of it, like the show and how they presented it, like just losing their shit on Twitter and stuff like that. And I've just been like, wow, that's pretty crazy. And I guess I've been involved in the community so long that I can see where this came from. And it's the sort of like, to me, it's like you're just taking the basis of like what would make good fan fiction, or I won't even say good because I think you could arguably say it's probably not even good writing. It's just popular writing tropes and popular like character archetypes getting put into professional writing, and that doesn't always serve the story, which I think is a nice transition into some of our other points from our original discussion, which is kind of like how we said in the first section, it's like you're not really learning how to write if you're just writing fan fiction. What do you think about that? Because I know you had some points on that too.
So the best football coach I ever had in my life had a saying, and actually there was a popular saying, and I used to get mad at the saying. The saying was practice makes perfect. And this always used to drive him crazy. And his response was always, that's fucking wrong. Perfect practice makes perfect. If
Yeah.
all you're practicing is, bad habits, those are the bad habits that you're going to use in games. And
Yeah.
as I'm watching fan fiction happen, and I'm watching all of the bad habits that people have developed from fan fiction leak out into books and television, and it's frightening
It
because
is.
the same thing that attracts people to fan fiction, the knowing the characters, knowing the world, sort of having this pre-built runway to take off on, really hampers your skill as a writer because the hardest things to do are to you know do your world building, do your characterization, sort of lay out where your story is going. And so if you don't have to do any of that because all of that work has been done by somebody else, it involves a ton of bad habit building. And you point to something like Rings of Power, where if you were writing fan fiction for Lord of the Rings and you wanted to do a Galadriel story, you don't have to set her up and make her likable because the built-in fan base already likes her.
Exactly. I think that's just so true, because it's like you're just assuming that like the audience knows stuff, and so you would kind of cut corners because somebody already did the work for you. And I definitely see that with stuff, because it's like I have never read Lord of the Rings. I haven't read the Silmarillion, and I have no idea what this story is. When I watch the show, I can't make heads or tails of it. And then I think I've noticed this in my review of House of the Dragon, and when I've watched Wheel of Time, is that like it's weird because we know the stories and we know the characters, so when we watch stuff on screen, we kind of fill in the blanks with the knowledge that we already have, which is kind of weird because that's kind of like a side effect of the fan fiction community. Is it's like we've built the like we know the characters, we know the world, so we kind of fill in the blanks with whatever the story isn't doing on screen or in any kind of novel or whatever you're reading. And yeah, it's just, yeah, like you said, you're learning bad habits. And that is definitely something like for a good example, and I've brought this up in our rewatches and stuff. It's like I was watching a scene um in Wheel of Time, and Rand goes with Matt to Tarvalon, and they're in what should be like an inn. And in the books, they go to the library, and that's where he meets Loyal, and we learn who Loyal is. And um, I was just filling the blanks in when I was watching the show, but my brother, who didn't know anything about this at all, like the way that they show it in the show is they don't explain who Loyal is. There's no kind of dialogue between the two characters. It's just, bam, Rand is in the bookstore. He called it a bookstore because he didn't even know what it was. He's in the bookstore. He picks up a book. Oh, there's a picture of a dragon. Rand's a dragon, and then like Loyal is just some dude in the bookstore. So it was like it's stuff like that, and it's kind of hard because we know and we fill in the blanks because we've read the source material, but like just basic kind of exposition and kind of like setting the scenes, like writers don't get that because they're so used to writing in somebody else's, playing in somebody else's sandbox, like we say so many times. And I just want to say, like, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. This is also like fan fiction is good because it does allow, it's kind of training wheels. You can learn things. Like I will say that when I wrote my really long Game of Thrones fanfic, the 350,000 word thing I did, I learned from that experience that the way that George R.R. Martin does the character chapters with similar point of, like, one point of view character chapters, it's a really limiting way of writing, because once you start expanding your cast of characters and once the story starts moving, it ends up like exponentially increasing the length of your novel. And so I'm glad that I wrote that fan fiction because I learned from that, but I'm not sure other people are doing that. And I think, to me, like, I see that a lot in sort of the kind of predominance of like the young adult genre of literature, and then what of course we've been talking about with what we've seen in film and television. So I think it's just like we need to get more people that go back to the like fundamentals of storytelling, and they kind of like, we need people to realize that like fan fiction and fandom and stuff is like training wheels, and at some point in time you have to learn that. So I think that's probably a good part to end this section, the middle section here, because then we'll get on to the really bad parts about fan fiction that we've noticed. And I will say too, that we're not just going to sit here and give you all the bad things. We're going to also give you some ways of improving your writing and kind of taking the training wheels off and not making these mistakes, so you can not only improve your own writing in your own original writing, but like with your fan fiction writing too. And so you can learn stuff and grow as a writer. So thank you very much, Alex, for coming and talking to us here, and we'll join us in section 3, and we'll go over the really ugly parts of fan fiction. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you again next time.